Welcome to the Florida Veterans for Common Sense July meeting, and we have a terrific program scheduled for tonight that I'm sure everyone's going to enjoy and learn a lot. It's my pleasure to introduce Brooks Armstrong. And Brooks is, I'm proud to say, is one of our seriously hardworking members. He's participates with our environmental working group, and he has lots of good ideas through that, and he actually brought us the information about the threat to our water supply with phosphate mining, because the Peace River watershed, where a lot of the mining, or at least the companies want to mine, if there's a big break or a spillage into the Peace River, that can affect all of us. There's, if I'm not mistaken, over 1 million people that benefit from the water that comes out of the Peace River. And if it's polluted, it's not going to be easy to clean up. And so that'd be a major problem. I don't know if I want to mention this or not about Brooks, because we seem to have so many guys from the Navy, but he's another Navy veteran. So we're proud to have Brooks as a member, and he's really enjoyable to work with. And Brooks, we appreciate everything that you do. And so could you please introduce our speakers for tonight?
Okay, well, thank you, Gene. And I have with me today my colleagues, Ragan Whitlock. He's from Center for Biological Diversity, a staff attorney there, and he covers the phosphate, all phosphate issues. And Rachel Curran, attorney for our organization, People for Protecting Peace River, and environmental attorney. And they will each give a portion of this presentation as well, and they can give a little more introduction of what they do when that comes. Yeah, our presentation is an overview of phosphate mining and fertilizer production in Central Florida. It's a cradle to the grave view. In other words, beginning to end view of what phosphate mining is all about in Central Florida. And I'll talk about the phosphate strip mining part of it, and then Rachel will take over with fertilizer production, and then Ragan will follow on there. We're losing a lot of habitat to phosphate strip mining. About 350,000 acres have already been lost. And this is an example. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Endangered species habitat. Next slide. Agricultural habitat, and it's being lost at an alarming rate to the industry. And they're also mining in our aquifers, since our aquifers are so close to the surface here in Florida. Next slide. This is an aerial view of phosphate strip mining, and you can see why it's called strip mining. They systematically move back and forth, digging up the soil. They remove the top 30 or 40 feet of what they call overburden, and put it into an adjacent area so that they can get at that area underneath of this overburden called the matrix. Next slide. The drag line will dig into this matrix, and these are huge drag lines. That's a 300-foot long boom on that electric machine there. Millions of tons, several 100 million tons, pounds, but it is a huge machine. So that drag line picks up a scoop of this matrix and dumps it into a pit called a slurry pit. I think you see it there in sort of the middle of the picture. There's a water cannon that breaks up all of the aggregate into a slurry. Next slide. And just another view, 2 drag lines working. Next slide, please. In the foreground, you see one of these slurry pipes that will carry this mixture of phosphate, sand, and clay. It's about, this matrix is about equal mixtures of phosphate, sand, and clay. So it'll send, they pump this slurry back up to a float plant or beneficiation plant. Next slide, please. This is a view of a beneficiation plant, kind of distance view. They're huge. And so this is where the phosphate is separated from the rest of the soils. The clays are spun out or with centrifuges. They are the finest particles. They'll go back to an area called a clay settling area. Some of the phosphate is screened out so that the screen material are the larger particles. And then probably the majority by far of the phosphate is chemically separated with reagent and fuel oil. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the clay settling areas, this will occupy probably 40% of the post-mine landscape. And this is a large decanting area. These can be a mile square, these ponds, where the clay settles out. It takes decades because the clay is so fine that it just takes that long to settle out. Even after that period, the soils are not stable. In addition to the chemicals that I mentioned are also disposed of in these clay settling areas. It shows a slurry pipe coming back out of the beneficiation plant, pumping the waste and the clay in here. Next slide. Once the sand is separated from the phosphate, that would be the next part of the process. And as I mentioned, it's chemicals. That sand is pumped back out to these strips where the mining has occurred to fill in the strips. Remember, this sand comes from 30 plus feet below the surface and is chemically tainted and now goes out to begin the basics of what they call reclamation. Next slide, please. Once we're all done with this process, they do reclamation. This what you see is a berm with Kogan grass. Next slide. And it's a very pernicious, exotic, invasive that colonizes disturbed areas, does not allow for anything else to grow with wherever it is. As you see this field of Kogan grass, it's all over in the mined areas. Next slide, please. So what I like to do here, and I'm sorry, Mosaic, but I'm juxtaposing your ads, the realities that you've seen in the past few slides. Next slide. Next slide. So we see television, we've seen television ads, heard radio ads, and these are billboards that you've seen here. Next slide, please. This is DeSoto County in 2018. People for Protecting Peace River were in the 4th of July parade, and our friends from Center for Biological Diversity were there as well. We have many coalition partners, but this was our slide here. So next slide, please. And this is Rachel, and we had workshops that we did before this hearing, which was July of 2018, and we called the local people together to try to get as many people educated about the realities of phosphate mining as possible. Next slide. We had a sign campaign. Some folks were out there putting signs out around the county. Next slide, please. And so this became one of our slogans that caught on. Next slide. Next slide. The hearing itself, standing room only, and you're looking at one half of the room. You see the 2 rows in the front reserved for applicant. Those are the only empty seats. These other people, you could count on one hand the number of people that were for this rezoning. Next slide, please. This hearing went on for more than 2 days. After Mosaic's presentation, the public spoke one after another, various levels of expertise, and giving their testimony. And the next slide, please. We did win a 4-to-1 no vote, no rezone for phosphate strip mining. This is our billboard as you're moving into Arcadia, which is DeSoto County. This is our billboard, which is still there today. We'll be there for another year. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel because we've seen where the phosphate comes from, but now we need to know where it's going and what's done with it. So thanks very much, folks. And this is Ms. Rachel Curran.
Hey, thanks, Brooks. You want to go ahead and push it to the next slide, Rich? Thank you. Hi, my name is Rachel Curran. I'm an environmental attorney, and I've been following this industry, the fertilizer industry, particularly the phosphate fertilizer industry, since about 2016. I can tell you that There are not many of us working on it, and we're hoping to change that as we raise awareness, and that's part of why we do talks like this. But 3PR, People for Protecting Peace River, they've been in this fight since at least the 90s in one form or another, and have been really as grassroots as it can get. They are on the ground where it all begins, and that's the mines. Part of the problem with really addressing the problems of fertilizer production and use is the sheer scale of the problem and how many moving parts there are to it, and the ability for the industry to compartmentalize that damage. So when you're thinking about a mine, you're not thinking about where that ore that is dug up is going, and that produces just as much damage, if not more, and is really out of control. And then we're not even getting to the use part of the fertilizer product, which we all know causes eutrophication, and our whole phosphate and nitrogen cycle is overloaded globally, and we're still creating more. But this is just one part of that problem that I'm going to focus on today. You're looking at a phosphogypsum stack right now in that picture. Next slide. So again, Brooks talked to you about the mining. He talked to you a little bit about beneficiation and clay slime areas, which are very toxic and very difficult to reclaim, not somewhere I would ever want to live or eat food that was grown on top of one of those. And I'm going to talk to you about phosphoric acid production, which is the building block of fertilizer. Phosphatic fertilizers are ammoniated diammonium monoammonium phosphate, which are agricultural commodities typically sold to agricultural distributors, and not something that you're going to buy in the Home Depot, but it impacts you nonetheless. Next slide. So just a real brief overview of how fertilizer is made. So that ore is dug up in Bone Valley, typically, and there's phosphate deposits all over the world, but Florida has not the largest, but one of the most easily accessible deposits, which is more of a curse than a blessing, because that means that 75% of the nation's fertilizer is produced here in Florida, and 25% of global production occurs here in Florida. And that means it's really an export product. It's not, this fertilizer goes straight to the port, and yet we're maintaining 100% of the waste from that production. So that ore is dug up. That's what you're seeing at the left. That's phosphate rock or fluorapatite. It's acidulated with sulfuric acid, and then that chemical reaction creates phosphoric acid and phosphogypsum as a waste product. That phosphogypsum is 5 tons for every 1 ton of fertilizer of phosphoric acid. So we're getting an incredibly large amount of waste. We're already producing a large amount of fertilizer. We're producing 5 times that amount of waste. After you get the phosphoric acid and it's processed further to get to a certain level of concentration, they ammoniate that, meaning they're going to pipeline in ammonia. That's usually synthesized by the Haber-Bosch process. It's incredibly energy intensive and very damaging to our climate and our planet. But just so you know, that phosphoric acid isn't done once we get that stack. It goes to another plant where it becomes the final fertilizer products. And typically that other plant involves a lot of hazardous wastes that are not exempt in the same way that phosphogypsum is. Next slide. So this is the New Wales stack. It's one of the largest fertilizer plants, and it's the highest producing fertilizer plant in the state of Florida, and it's also one of the largest stacks in the country. Mosaic owns this one. Mosaic is the leading phosphate fertilizer producer in the world. They've got about 60% market share in domestically, and about 90% globally when you consider all of their joint ventures and affiliates. Next slide. So why is it kept in stacks? Solely because of its radiation. So the entire reason that EPA requires phosphogypsum to be held in stacks is because they were worried about it going elsewhere. And that was a rule that was put in place in 1989. It's not the reason we have stacks. That's something the industry has been doing for decades prior to that rule. But so it was just really a way to say, okay, you're stacking it. We're going to keep this like it is, because putting it elsewhere, distributing that throughout the commerce, putting it in products, putting it in roads would be even more dangerous from an exposure point of view. So phosphogypsum has 35 picocuries per gram. Picocuries is a measure of radiation, and that radiation is primarily coming from radium-226, which is a long-lived, that its immediate daughter is radon gas. So 1600-year half-life means that in 1600 years, whatever radium is there, we're going to still have half of it left. And we're still producing more. So that gas is the second leading cause of lung cancer nationally. Florida, and especially in the Central Florida region, does have a higher rate of lung cancer than the national average. Again, there have not been studies to figure out why, but that is true. So we're looking at radiation that's 35 times the level of natural background soil. Still considered low-level radiation. We're not talking about acute injury here. This is more of a chronic concern. If you're living next to these stacks, if you're constantly exposed in some way to that radiation over a lifetime, your likelihood of increased cancer, your cancer risk increases. But beyond the radiation, we've also got a lot of other toxic constituents. And again, EPA primarily as of now is just regulating this from the point of view of a radiation control measure. So we've got arsenic, lead, nickel, cadmium, chromium, silver, antimony, copper, mercury, thallium. Those are just a few of the toxic constituents that are regulated as hazardous wastes. But because of phosphogypsum's sheer magnitude, as far as volume is concerned, Congress decided to exempt this from being treated as if it were hazardous waste. Hazardous waste facilities do not look like phosphogypsum stacks. They are much more controlled, double-lined, much safer than what we're looking at today. And ideally, they have a lot less leaks and problems and catastrophes like we're about to see. Next slide. So in addition to those known constituents, so far we know about the low pH from the sulfuric acid, we know about those toxic heavy metals, we know about the radiation. There's all kinds of other stuff in that stack because the industry as a whole has been mixing hazardous waste from that downstream diammonium phosphate type fertilizer plants into their phosphoric acid plants. So those diammonium phosphate plants that happen later down in the process, those are regulated as if they were hazardous waste facilities. The phosphogypsum stacks are not. They're just piles. They're just supposed to be this benign, quote unquote benign, low level radiation waste. But we do know, because they've been caught several times, and this is not just Mosaic, I'm putting Mosaic up as an example, but several of the fertilizer companies have undergone consent decrees or have joint consent decrees with EPA. We know we're not quite certain just exactly how much of that hazardous waste is in the stacks, how it's been treated, how it's being recovered, but we know it's in there. And in addition to all of the known constituents coming from the ore. Next slide. So what does that mean for you and your health? We don't know, because of those same exemptions that the fertilizer industry lobbied for and got. Both at the congressional level and later on at the EPA level. There has been no programmatic, comprehensive study of the health impacts of this industry. We don't have any epidemiological data. We have some risk modeling as far as what your likelihood of increased risk might be given how close you are to a stack, but that's really only based on the radiation exposure. And that modeling was done in 1989. So we're not sure how many more people are exposed. A lot more people have moved in next to those stacks, and the EPA has not repeated that modeling. But we do know that fertilizer workers are dying at a higher rate than a statistically significantly elevated rate due to all cancers, all causes, including lung cancer and leukemia. So that's just the problems with the stacks if they function like they're supposed to. They're a radiation risk if they're perfect, if they never fail. But we've got a lot more than that going. And this picture shows every single little dot that you see is a subsidence incident, which is sort of geological speak or Florida Geological Survey speak for a sinkhole. This is sinkhole country in this part of the state. And that arrow is pointing to the New Wales phosphogypsum stack, the South Stack. So this is a 1994 photo, one of the first times, and the first that we know of, that the stack collapsed within itself into a sinkhole. And that was over 80 million gallons directly into the Floridan aquifer at that time. Then we have the 2016 sinkhole, which many of you might remember, and that was 215 million gallons. Same facility, different stack. This is the south stack, but a massive amount of radioactive, toxic, acidic processed wastewater went into the Floridan aquifer then. Both our state regulators, DEP, and the industry have claimed repeatedly that that waste is not something to be worried about. Even if it went into the aquifer, we're pumping, they're still pumping all these years later. We're pumping, and because we're pumping through our recovery wells, we're capturing all of that, and none of it is leaving the property underground. So if you think of our karst geology, and you know that there's movement in the aquifer and it's constantly flowing, there's all kinds of conduit. Industry and our regulators are claiming that that's all somehow being captured. But an independent study in 2018 tried to model where that waste goes and found that it's really uncertain where it all went, and really a large scale risk considering how much went down that hole. And so those two incidences are the real ones that made the news, but there have been others. There was the 2009 sinkhole in North Florida that released 84 million gallons into the Floridan aquifer. And then there was two more at this very facility that never broke the news because DEP and the industry never told us. So here's what we found in a public records quest. That's a schematic showing another sinkhole, but it's called an anomaly in this situation. And it's an unknown amount of processed water and phosphogypsum that was lost to the aquifer. And here's another schematic from that same facility, different anomaly. And these are the only ways we found out about it. Next slide. So in addition to the sinkhole risk, we've also got, these stacks are all located in a very hurricane vulnerable area. So I have that picture on the right, that's Hurricane Francis. And if you notice, Francis came in from the East Coast, and yet Riverview stack, which is, can you hit the next button? There we go. The Riverview stack, which is right on Tampa Bay, suffered damage from that storm in 2004, which was not a direct hit by any sense of the word. And even that non-direct hit was able to cause a spill of 65 million gallons, and after a dam breached from the waves overtopping and damaging that dam. And we also have sea level rise to worry about for the same reason. So that Riverview stack is right on Tampa Bay, and this shows various levels of sea level rise under different scenarios. But even with 1 foot of sea level rise, we're already going to see inundation of these radioactive, toxic, hazardous waste constituent containing stacks that are not regulated as if they were hazardous waste. Next slide. Here's just another shot of the Riverview stack to give you a sense of how close it is to the water. Again, this is processed water on top. This is actually considered a closed stack, but in Florida, we like to reuse our closed stacks and keep putting water on top of them. In this case, this is processed water from the active stack, which is on top of the closed stack, making it just as dangerous as if it were open. And again, that's right on the bay. Here's the east stack, and you can see new developments going up right across the street. Again, many of these people don't even know what it is that they're looking at. And of course, we have Piney Point. I'm not going to have enough time to go into the long saga that is Piney Point, but suffice it to say, we're still getting a handle on the damage wrought by that latest incident. And this has been a long history, starting way back, before the bankruptcy, but really where it all began as far as the state became involved was in 2001 when the former owner went bankrupt. And that's something that we've seen before, and we're going to continue to see as this industry continues to consolidate and continues to get larger and continues to get more risky. Eventually, there's going to be a disaster that puts a large corporation out of business, and we're going to be left to pick up the pieces. So this is, next slide. This is nothing new, and it's only getting worse. This is a schematic from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, just showing the timing of some of the fish die-offs and the red tide blooms, and the likely connection between Piney Point and that historic bloom that we saw later that summer, deep into the bay in parts that we had never seen it before in decades. Really a lot of evidence showing that this was caused by Piney Point. But just so you didn't think that this was only a Florida problem, there are stacks all over the country, and wherever there's phosphogypsum, there is a problem. So Florida, again, is the heart of the industry domestically, but there are stacks everywhere, all throughout the United States, particularly in Idaho, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Florida. Those are some of where some of the active facilities are. Florida has 25 stacks. There's about 60 legacy stacks and a few actives scattered throughout the country. Next slide. And again, the problems with those stacks are not just local to us. So in St. James Parish, which is in Louisiana, Cancer Alley, there's a stack there that's been unstable, was shifting, really an emergency situation similar to Piney Point, where water had to be shifted all around. Crisis much more averted there that time. But again, this is an Uncle Sam plant that has a long history of environmental damage as well. Next slide. And then we've got the Simplot tribe up in Idaho fighting a stack expansion into their tribal lands. And they recently won there. And I just included that to show you that when locals do and rise up, there you can win and you can stop an industry that seems unstoppable. And then we have the Mississippi Phosphates Superfund site, in which many of these are going to end up Superfund sites, or which doesn't mean that means they're going to be cleaned up anytime soon. Again, once something becomes a Superfund site, we as the public have very little input in how that actually gets cleaned up. So just because something's declared a Superfund site doesn't mean you don't have to worry about it anymore. But this is one example of another company going bankrupt, violating the law right before they went bankrupt by discharging, and this time intentionally discharging several million gallons of processed water into the natural water body adjacent to the stack. And there, again, in Mississippi, got the same sea level rise problem that we have in Tampa Bay. So that's a bit about what can go wrong and what does go wrong and what's going to continue to go wrong. But again, I want to bring it back to, let's say nothing goes wrong. Let's say these stacks operate just as they should. They're still emitting toxic dust and radionuclides. And it is no surprise that these new expansions and newer stacks are being built in communities of low wealth and historically Black areas and areas where there is not a lot of power. People feel really, really run down by this industry and by our regulators that have not given them a voice. So Progress Village is one really, really strong example of the environmental justice concern. That community pre-existed the stack. Obviously, that was built in the 50s when residents from Tampa were displaced from the construction of 275 and founded a Progress Village as a way to provide homeownership to Black people that weren't able to buy homes previously. So the community was doing really well until the fertilizer company at the time, Gardenier, which is now Mosaic owns this plant, decided that they needed to expand. And they expanded just right adjacent to that community. And they've been under that shadow of a radioactive, dusty stack ever since. And I just put this up here because, again, we don't really know the full extent of the health risks, but we do know that the EPA has determined 9 in 100,000, a maximum individual risk, which is the amount of risk that the person most exposed to the radiation from these stacks. And we're only talking about the radiation. We're not talking about the other stuff. The person that is most exposed to that radiation, if there are 100,000 people just like that, at that level of exposure, 9 would die as a result. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but I would pose that nobody should be dying on behalf of the fertilizer industry. Nobody should be accepting any risk when they're not receiving any benefit. The entirety of that benefit is going to a corporation with outsized influence. And the solution, there's certainly a stack problem. It's certainly an unacceptable risk, but the solution is not something that I would leave to the hands of the industry itself. And Ragan's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Brooks, and everyone here today. My name is Ragan Whitlock. I'm a staff attorney for the Center for Biological Diversity based in St. Petersburg, Florida, focused on phosphate issues for the last around 2 years, largely how it affects our water quality and endangered species, but also lately how it's begun to affect some of our communities and, as you'll see in a second, potentially road construction workers. To start this off, we're going to just be speaking about phosphogypsum. Rachel mentioned a moment ago that phosphate mining is a very waste-intensive process. 5 tons of phosphogypsum are created for every 1 ton of usable phosphoric acid produced. And we have a lot of it in the state of Florida. We currently have more than 1 billion tons of phosphogypsum stored in stack systems across the state. And more than 30 million are created every single year. And the industry recognizes that this is a problem. We're 2 years on the heels of Piney Point, and there's, scientific papers coming out all the time about how Tampa Bay has been affected by that spill. And the industry recognizes that, and the industry is pivoting towards what they would call solutions for their phosphogypsum problem. But in reality, as you'll see in a second, their potential solution is more of a revenue stream for themselves while subjecting Floridians, road construction workers, and our environment to further harm from this already prolifically harmful substance. Now, this is pretty data heavy, so I'll try to go through this in a high level. So you've likely heard about the use of phosphogypsum in road construction if you've been in and around Florida this legislative session. House Bill 1191 passed this year. It was sponsored by the Mosaic Company, pushed forward by many people in the phosphate industry. And we're going to take a bit of a high-level overview about the history of the use of phosphogypsum in road construction and what ultimately it could mean. Now, you can see at the very top of this slide, you can still find this statement on the Environmental Protection Agency's website when it comes to phosphogypsum. It remains prohibited from use in road construction. That's been the case for more than 30 years, and it still remains the case now, despite what House Bill 1191 spoke to this legislative session. And the reason it's prohibited is exactly some of the concerns that Rachel raised a moment ago. It's radioactive, it has heavy metals, and it's usually very nutrient laden. So specifically, the Environmental Protection Agency in the late 80s, early 90s, in response to a request from the fertilizer industry to use this in road construction, came out with these following findings. And primarily, there were 3 issues that they found. The first, and arguably the most important, was that road construction workers, the folks who would actually be handling this material on a daily basis, the frontline people for this incredibly dumb project, would be exposed to an unacceptably high cancer risk. The same maximum individual risk that Rachel mentioned a moment ago for folks near stack systems is also extended to road construction workers. However, EPA designed a project around the use of phosphogypsum. It always produced a maximum individual risk that was unacceptably high. So the very first thing that EPA found was that the folks that would be handling this material would be exposed to radioactivity and likely would have an increased chance of getting cancer. And they also found that it can cause adverse effects to nearby and surface groundwater resources through leaching of those same metals Rachel mentioned earlier ago. You have arsenic, cadmium, and many others that could potentially be inundated back to our bays and waterways. And the final one would be that the radionuclides could be resuspended into the air by wind and vehicular traffic. And what EPA did not find at the time, but I think it's worth mentioning now, is that radium-226, the radioactive compound in phosphogypsum, has a half-life of 1,600 years. And unfortunately, Hurricane Ian last September and the continuous threats that we've had from severe and heavy storms have proven that roads just don't last that long here in the state of Florida. And the risks posed by phosphogypsum road construction will outlive most of the roads that it would be put in. Okay, so this goes through some of the recent attempts and the history of using this product in road construction. So like I said a moment ago, in the early 90s, the EPA prohibited the use of phosphogypsum road construction after a fertilizer industry attempt. Fast forward to 2020. The Trump administration's EPA did approve a request again from the fertilizer industry, reversing its longstanding policy. Immediately, environmental organizations, including the Center for Biological Diversity, filed for a petition to reconsider the EPA, as well as initiated a lawsuit. And ultimately in 2021, under the Biden administration, the EPA withdrew its conditional approval of that Fertilizer Institute request. Things did not stay dormant for very long. Last year in 2022, Senator Roger Marshall out of Kansas introduced what was called the Sustain Act, which would have, much like House Bill 1191 does in Florida, authorizes the use nationwide of phosphogypsum. It was unclear what that would mean for the EPA prohibition at the time, but luckily that bill died, and nothing really was heard from it after that. Until this year, in 2023, following again another request from the fertilizer industry, specifically the fertilizer giant, the Mosaic Company, the Florida legislature did pass House Bill 1191, which would authorize phosphogypsum to be used in, and I'll put the quotes here as well as in the screen, a demonstration road project with a study date to be completed by April 2024. So where do we go from here? What we do know is that the Environmental Protection Agency has the ultimate authority. Any project that would use phosphogypsum in a live road, an outdoor space, must go through an application process to the Environmental Protection Agency. And that agency has the ultimate authority to reject any applications. That includes anything that comes from the Mosaic Company and anything that comes out of House Bill 1191. We heard on the floor, as this was passing through the Florida legislature, several things that were either, blanketly incorrect or just misguided. One of the things that we heard was that this would be a study that actually considered the implications to the health and safety of Floridians, road construction workers, and the environment. Bill sponsors then rejected amendments that would have looped in the EPA and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection into that decision-making process. And I, for one, do not believe that the Florida Department of Transportation is in the position to make a finding on the health and safety of a product in road construction. So ultimately, this is where we are. The Environmental Protection Agency still has a blanket prohibition. If anything were to come into a road near you, we would see it on an application. We would see it for the EPA, and we would see their rationale. We would understand why they said yes, why they approved a substance like this. And you would have watchdog organizations like the Center for Biological Diversity and People for Protecting Peace River thoroughly analyzing those decisions and seeing where we can go from here. And with that, looking at the time, do we have any questions for either Rachel, Brooks, or I as we go through this presentation?
If you do have a question on the Zoom, you could write it in the chat.
So it looks like we have a question from the floor here from Dennis Plews. So Dennis, come up.
Good evening. I'm curious as to whether you've explored the possibility of using the common law trespass action, which is incorporated in the Florida Constitution, 1968 version, wherein it holds that a property owner has an action in trespass against any neighboring property owner upon whose neighboring property owner's land and hazardous activity is being done that causes damages off the property. And if that's the case, then the adversely affected property owner has the right to bring an action in trespass for damages and injunctive relief. And I've never heard anything about that going on in these sorts of circumstances, but it seems to me it might have some application. So has that ever crossed your legal mind? And if so, what was your opinion?
Yeah, so that's more of a public nuisance theory, and that is a area of law that exists. It's not what I practice, not what Ragan practices either, and not to say that that's not the way, but it certainly is more of an ad hoc property owner approach that I don't know would have an impact as far as the broader population and environmental harm that exists beyond that damaged property right. So Ragan, I don't know if you have anything to add, but
Sure. And to tack onto that, there's a causation is a very tricky thing in the phosphate world. So a few of the major incidences that we mentioned, or Rachel mentioned a moment ago, you think of Piney Point and New Wales. When Piney Point had the massive release into Tampa Bay, it affected the greater Tampa Bay, and it'll continue to affect our water quality. It'd be very difficult in that situation for an aggrieved landowner to pinpoint a loss of property value or an issue on their own property, much like when the sinkholes have happened in New Wales. That's something that goes straight down, technically is confined to the property owned by the company, though it affects our drinking water for, millions of Floridians. So there's a migration offsite, and trespass issues in that regard are more popular with other forms of mining where there are a lot of like immediate spillover effects into another, property. But it is something that folks have looked at. It's not something that either Rachel or I have been largely focused on. We look at it through the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act lens. But I know there are, other attorneys who look for that when there are, possibilities of that stuff actually getting onto another homeowner's property.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, really the entire reason our environmental statutes evolved to what they are today, or were enacted in the first place, and this area of law exists, is because of the failure of that type of law to address our most pressing problems, trespass and just general tort law in general isn't quite going to cut it when it comes to an industry of this magnitude.
Well, let me add, you can also hold the corporate officers and directors who are involved in the decision-making personally responsible for the damages. So there's individual liability that can be inflicted upon the perpetrators in a proper case. Now, finding a proper case is the tricky bit, but it's a rather heavy cudgel in the legal armamentarium that you should not overlook. In a proper case, you might be able to bring the corporate officers of Mosaic into the courtroom and have them personally enjoined and have them personally held liable for damages. Again, you have to have the right case. So if it happens, please don't forget that.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. I hope that some of our better property law minds in the state do have good opportunities. I see that there's a question and answer typed into the chat. Is it okay to answer that? Perfect. So I see a question from Elliot Prout, I believe, and my apologies if I mispronounced the name. The question is, what do you see as the best solution for the existing phosphogypsum stacks? And Rachel, if you'd like to tack on, but I wanted to immediately jump in with what comes to mind is better oversight and better management. Our main issue right now comes from a lack of oversight. Rachel mentioned earlier that there is an exemption for this stuff. Phosphogypsum, despite it having all of the characteristics of toxic and hazardous waste, is currently not being regulated as hazardous waste purely because of the economics to the industry. And that is not my speculation, that is EPA finding. So it is not being regulated properly. And even to the extent it should be regulated as non-hazardous waste, the Environmental Protection Agency has delegated extensive authority to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, who has failed to properly oversee these sites for decades. That's why a Piney Point disaster happened 20 years after the stack was closed.
As far as solutions are concerned, I would be really nice to be able to explain in great detail how we're going to, transition our food system away from what it currently is, our currently synthetic fertilizer dependent food system, so that we don't need to be generating this fertilizer product and its waste in the first place. But while we have it, there's a sense that science is going to come in and save the day, but there's a real problem, especially in Florida, and it's baked into our statute, with industry control over our academic institutions that are looking at these issues. So we've got the Florida Institute for Phosphate Research pumping out all kinds of studies. None of them have to do with how do we make less phosphogypsum, how do we make fertilizer, how do we make it safer, how do we make it less radioactive, how do we treat this waste? It's mostly concerned about how can we sell it back to taxpayers or back to consumers in a way that makes the industry more money. And that is because of the way it is set up by design for industry to have the most control. So I know that there's a solution out there. We're not going to get it under our current system.
One thing I'll point out too, if you do have a question, I've been advised that the chat's disabled for the webinar. So write your question in the question and answer thing. And I have a curious question, which may not be relevant for those of this generation, but for the next generation, it may be. If the phosphate companies can mine as much as they want to, how long will the phosphate deposits last? Does anybody know?
So that's another problem with government-funded research and development on behalf of the industry. We're not running out of phosphate reserves anytime soon. There used to be all kinds of reports about, oh, it's a finite resource, and it is. It's non-renewable, but we've got probably a few centuries worth of reserves left. So hoping that we run out and somehow survive that isn't really an option. In addition, a lot of the research and a lot of the science funding is going into how do we get even more ore out of reserves that were previously uneconomical to mine. So what was previously inaccessible will suddenly be more accessible, and that could continue to be expanded indefinitely. Similar to what we've seen with fossil fuels, right? We were going to run out of oil, and then our government sponsored research and development that led to the fracking technologies that we have today, and oil sands and all the rest. So running out isn't the problem. It's are we going to survive as a planet as a result of the damage? That's the problem.
I'm curious, how many employees does Mosaic employ? And how much of the wealth of the phosphate that's extracted from Florida remains in Florida?
Sure. I'm not up to date on the exact numbers of Mosaic employees. I know it's close to it depends on the plant, but they're global, they have global operations. So that would be hard for me to answer, but I believe it's somewhere around 6,000 in the state. I'm not quite sure on that. That might be including the connected
Rachel, I think I've heard the number 4,000.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably more accurate.
Be statewide.
And to put a fine point on that, compared to those numbers of workers, the Mosaic company through their own financials made $3.7 billion in net revenue last year alone.
How does the state capture any of that money, since it's the state's natural resources?
Right. Well, Mosaic or the industry and the state will tell you that there's a severance tax that is applied to all the phosphate ore that's removed from the earth, and that severance tax then goes to a trust fund, which in theory is, the property of the state, and it's used to sort of remedy the damage. That a lot of that trust fund is going to that research and development that I told you about that is so problematic, that is industry controlled. So we're really not capturing any benefit at all. And I wouldn't be fooled by that severance tax talking point of the industry.
I can add something here too. I would say that when you consider any financial benefit to the state, you have to subtract the costs that we bear as taxpayers, such as for things like Piney Point, or for legacy messes that we have to clean up, and damage to our by far bigger industry, the tourist industry, or the fishing industry, when they pollute the waters. There might even be a net negative benefit from this industry.
Does anybody know how much we're spending as taxpayers maintaining these legacy messes?
That's a good question, Gene. I don't know if you guys have an answer, Ragan, Rachel.
Well, just the latest Piney Point alone, I think we topped 100 million, and that was just that one incident in a very long line of incidents. 215 million gallons in 2020, preceded by 270 million gallons in 2011, 248 million gallons barged out to the Gulf of Mexico in 2003, 50 million in 2001. So, start to add up and think about, that was all done by the state using taxpayer money, and no one's aggregated it. Again, this industry isn't comprehensively studied, so it's really hard to give you numbers like that. But I would imagine it's hundreds and hundreds of millions.
And as was mentioned in the chat here, one of the Piney Point proffered solutions is to inject this waste into an underground well where hopefully it will not migrate again into our drinking water. And that's another, multi-$100 million project. So it's taking a lot of taxpayer money and a lot of county money in order to close a system that is meant to be closed for more than 20 years. And recognizing we may not be able to get to all of these answers in the chat, I did want to flag one from Cody earlier that asked, what actions would you recommend citizens take to fight the expansion of the industry and to better regulate existing facilities? I think the 2018 fight in DeSoto County is the best, response that's emblematic of what you can do. I mean, the DeSoto County commissioners heard citizens, they heard the folks that came to that meeting that day, and I think the public outcry really slowed down the expansion of mining operations into DeSoto County, and we'll have to continue that fight for decades on end. So whenever an application is renewed, or whenever you hear rumblings, to make your voice heard, both at the commission and city level, as well as making your voices heard to FDEP, and make sure, if you're not already, to follow People for Protecting Peace River, as well as the Center for Biological Diversity, as we will provide updates on different action points and fights that we may have heard of a bit early and can try to loop folks into.
Dean, did you say that the webinar chat is not available?
Yeah, the question and answer, that's where the question should be. And
Okay.
there's several that have popped up now. Maybe we'll take two more, and then we're past the hour and we'll call it quits, because I'm sure you guys have done such a great job, and it's tiring answering these questions.
Sure. I see one about how large a role does big sugar and big ag play in all of these threats. That's a complicated question. Our food system is very complex, but there is a connection there. I'll just start by saying that big ag and big fertilizer are not always friends. All right. So because of this consolidated power that the fertilizer industry has achieved, and now we're down to a few fertilizer companies with a really outsized share of the market. There's a lot of allegations of price fixing and commodities manipulation, and not really playing fair to farmers in a way that makes farmers have to raise the price of their crops because they're at the mercy of the fertilizer industry when the price of fertilizer is manipulated in that way. And there's been some reporting on that. Whether they have a role to play in the solution, of course. I mean, transitioning away from synthetic fertilizer use would be great. And it would be great if our federal government subsidized that type of farming just as much as they did conventional farming.
Bingo. We talked about that earlier today, didn't we, guys, from the environmental working group here. Now, there are other methods of farming. Some may consider them controversial, but they're highly successful, large-scale methods under the headings of regenerative agriculture or organic regenerative or various other titles. In some cases, the big industries have co-opted those names, which makes that a problem. But the bottom line there is there are solutions. There are solutions on the horizon, if they're not already here, to the use of weaning ourselves off of synthetic fertilizers.
Right.
We don't need to be destroying farmland in one location in order to supplement, which is, by the way, a temporary supplement, and a supplement that actually damages soil in another location.
That makes a lot of sense, Brooks. With that, then I think we'll call it into the meeting because we're past the hour. And
Okay.
I would certainly like to extend my personal thanks to our three presenters actually tonight. It was a terrific presentation, probably more than most of us can absorb in this short period of time, but it's a start. And that's what we like to do as Florida Veterans for Common Sense, educate ourselves and the public on these kind of issues so that we can take action. We view ourselves as an action group. And maybe by the time the next legislature rolls around, we'll have better representatives and we won't have bills passed like these crazy ideas to put phosphate waste into our roads. So we really thank you for raising our awareness, and a particular thanks for Brooks for all the work that you do, Brooks, and working so hard with our group. It's very appreciated. So with that, we'll adjourn the meeting.